Hey. You. Hi there. It's 4:19. Do you have a minute? Good. Then let's pack a bowl. 'Cause it's time for Cannabis Talk, a special 420 themed segment of the Almost Daily Zencast, hosted by spiritual cannabis mystic, the incorrigible Mr. Zappa. Let's get lit, folks! Yeah. Welcome back to a bonus episode of Cannabis Talk. I realized when I stopped recording, it wasn't even 4:20 yet, and so I said, fuck it. Here we go. Round 2, Cannabis Talk. I'm going to kick it off with a quote from Terence McKenna. I've referenced him often enough. I figure I'd bring you a couple of concrete statements so that you'd know a little more about what he has to say. And for those curious to look him up, unless I butchered it here in this note-taking, his name is spelled T-E-R-E-N-C-E-M-C-K-E-N-N-A. Terence McKenna. Quote, if every alcoholic were a pothead, if every crack user were a pothead, if every smoker smoked only cannabis, the social consequences of the, quote, drug problem, end quote, would be transformed. And let me tell you, I agree wholeheartedly with that sentiment, that statement. And of course, you know, we have a massive alcohol problem, drinking and driving problem, and if you look around, nobody's freaking out about that, and no one's calling for the abolition of alcohol. But that's a whole nother subject, which I'm not calling for the abolition of alcohol. I just think it's ridiculous. So I wanted to open with that one, but here's a couple of other tidbits from Mr. McKenna's mind worth pondering and given a quick think to. Quote, it diminishes the power of ego, comma, has a mitigation effect on competitiveness, causes one to question authority, and reinforces the notion of the merely relative importance of social values. Now that's a weird and wacky statement, especially if the persons listening to it are those who adhere very strongly or cling very strongly to some construct of social values, right? But I think that the relative is not automatically a dismissive or diminutive term. It's a term that means to indicate relativism, I think, right? The importance of social values is relative to other factors. And that the social value is not things that are labeled social values, or a much more familiar in our current echo chamber of echo chambers, family values. These things are not absolutes, right? That's what he's talking about there. It's not that we should destroy them all. I don't think he's trying to get to that crazy level. But he claims that cannabis diminishes the power of ego. It as a mitigating effect on competitiveness and causes one to question authority. Those are some pretty powerful things for a plant to do to a person. Right? A little almost borderline outlandish sounding. But I bring to you, my friends, my personal assertion that with my experience, I have found that these statements are indeed true. Here's a different statement from him. Quote, "There is no doubt that cannabis is trivialized as a commodity and is degraded by the designation of, quote, recreational drug. But there is also no doubt that when used occasionally in a context of ritual and culturally reinforced expectation of a transformation of consciousness, cannabis is capable of nearly the full spectrum of psychedelic effects associated with hallucinogens." Whoa! Whoa! Now, I've never personally felt like I've experienced hallucinations while consuming cannabis. And I have explored cannabis in many different ways. But I will tell you that I have had some deeply profound moments of insightful inner visioning, question mark. I don't want to label it something that makes it sound supernatural. I don't want to label it something that people will dismiss as impossible. But yes, I have had really vivid imagery-based phenomena or experiences that I don't want to call hallucinations, as is implied by the unfortunate label for plants that are called hallucinogens. But we'll put a pin in that. Come back to it in a little bit. Let's go back up here. "There is no doubt that cannabis is trivialized as a commodity and is degraded by the designation recreational drug." Words, 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 my friends. Labels matter. Labels matter because no matter... too many uses of the word matter. Labels matter. Why? When you label something, people assume that they have an understanding of that something, even if they have no direct experience with it. a label is useful to convey information about something so we can wrap our brains around it without getting up close and personal. I don't want to prove that radioactive emissions are really bad and harmful by walking into some radioactive emissions, because I don't think I'll turn into the Hulk. And if I do turn into some Hulk-like creature, I don't really need that in my life, right? That, for all the fun and adorableness that it is in the movies, that actual condition would probably be really, really obnoxious. Should it ever happen to someone in real life. So, I have long maintained, in terms of this podcast, long before I got to reading this quote, and I certainly don't think I got my opinion from this quote. This quote is something that I've gathered because I was thinking, I'm Terence McKenna. I keep talking about Terence McKenna. I'd better put some Terence McKenna quotes together and do a thing. The potential that is available to any given individual, of course, there are plenty of examples of folks for which it seems to be very not for them, right? Like and to the extreme that some arguably have a negative allergic or allergy-like reaction. Okay, so that being the case, we understand that there's always the proviso that it does not need to be for everyone. But I think he's got a really important point here, that if those of us who feel comfortable consuming it, limit our understanding of it to this label that they are offering us, then we're bypassing or giving up. We're erasing from our ability to perceive. We're filtering out. We're blockading ourselves from a wealth of phenomena that may not occur on its own because we've chosen to identify and limit our understanding through the use of this particular label. And I think that's something that we need to spend time contemplating and discussing, both as a community of enthusiasts and at large, right? As a society at large, regardless of which, all of our component members, whether they are enthusiasts or not, whether they are consumers or not, whether they see it as medicine or not, we should have discussions that bring up these marginalized and long neglected through vilification arguments about the nature of how we could relate to or engage with these kinds of plants. I want to come back to the second half of that quote, but I want to read this big one because it's like at the center of everything. Quote, "Cannabis is anathema to the dominator culture because it deconditions or decouples users from accepted values. Because of its subliminally psychedelic effect, cannabis, when pursued as a lifestyle, places a person in intuitive contact with less goal-oriented and less competitive behavior patterns. For these reasons, marijuana is unwelcome in the modern office environment, which, while a drug such as coffee, which reinforces the values of industrial culture, is both welcomed and encouraged. Cannabis use is correctly sensed as heretical and deeply disloyal to the values of male dominance and stratified hierarchy. Legalization of marijuana is thus a complex issue, since it involves legitimatizing. I must have typed that wrong. since it involves making legitimate a social factor that might ameliorate or even modify ego-dominant values. Okay, so if you're a new listener and you're just running through this episode, getting through the rest, put a pin in ego and the idea of ego-dominant values, because we're going to do a dive in some past episodes. I've done dives into ego and its place in the universe, as opposed to just our psychological, subjective mind. But let's come back to this other sentence over here, right? That was a big mouthful. Anathema to the dominator culture, that which in my podcast I have been referring to as the culture of oppression, the system of oppression, the profiteers who operate the system of oppression. Cannabis has been, indeed, sort of anathema to them. Entheogenics at large, mystical, magical practices that liberate the mind from preconceived, arbitrary constructs. These are always anathema to what Terence McKenna calls the dominator culture, what I call the system of oppression, or the war profiteers that own everything. It deconditions or decouples users from accepted values. Does it force this upon you? No. Just like in other realms, in other arenas of discussion, I have to point out that the way the human being works in this world is that all originates from within. All originates from within. Now, that's a big, crazy statement. But let me look at it, tell it to you from this point of view. That which you experience with cannabis originates from within yourself. It doesn't do anything to you. It activates and integrates systems that are natural and organic in the human body. Pin in this, the human body has always had an endocannabinoid system, which then allows certain activities of deep thinking, deep imagination, deep intuitive processing, deep intuitive comprehension, deep visual exploration of conceptual imagery that is, for lack of a better term, inspired or received as inspiration. It does all these things not because it does something to you, but because, arguably, based on scientific evidence, for millennia in some lost part of history, we co-evolved with these magical plants, and we have receptors for these enzymes and these molecules that they create that enhance or activate modalities of operation that our human apparatus normally doesn't activate, and that we are discouraged from being aware of, and that the system of oppression, this dominator culture, doesn't want us to be aware of them for all the reasons that we've been warned, right? Was it George Carlin? They don't want a very educated public. They want a public just smart enough to work all the levers and machines and clock in and clock out and pull that paycheck, but not so smart that they complain about the system and how it's operated, right? And cannabis activates the mind and subtle energy systems, and I think it activates it vis-a-vis like the conveyance of what might arguably be called nutrients, molecules that the human body finds useful for engaging in these higher order, higher intensity, higher frequency, higher vibrational modalities of operation. How dare I say that? Here's why. I've gathered I have gathered and synthesized the anecdotal expression of individuals from all over the world, from all sorts of different sources, from various documentaries and blogs and etc. All the usual kinds of sources you might use to find information and opinions on any given subject, but specifically about entheogenics in contemporary use. Right? I've also, in past episodes of my life and my amateur academic sleuthing, investigated ancient cultures and notice a trend that there's a dismissive but historically accurate notation that many ancient cultures from all over the world participated in entheogenic practices that required the consumption of, in some way or another, these kinds of plants that would be labeled entheogenic by those who, coined the term or work with the term, that others might call magic plants, that others might call sacred plants, and that the system of oppression, or the dominator culture, as our friend Terence McKenna called it, would call criminal drugs. I'm going to close it out with this final sentence here that I wanted to read to y'all and share some thoughts on, or that extend from it. There is also no doubt that, and I already read it before, right? But I wanted to hit it again, so I'm just going to review it. There is also no doubt that, when used occasionally in a context of ritual and culturally reinforced expectation of transformation of consciousness, cannabis is capable of nearly the full spectrum of psychedelic effects associated with hallucinogens. Let's replace hallucinogens, my friends, with a much more respectful and respectable word, entheogenic. Right? Because if we say that it's a plant that gives you hallucinations, then we can start vilifying it, right? We leave the door open for vilification. Arguably, based on my synthesis of a plethora of individual reporting and group reporting and documentary evidence of people reporting their experiences et al., these aren't, in my opinion, so much artificial dreams or artificially imposed upon. They are like glimpses into alternate modalities of perceiving dimensional events, right? Arguably. Now, some people see their greatest fears manifested, and that may be, perhaps, because there is indeed a dark side, quote. Not in the way that Star Wars represents it, but in a more organic, simpler, subtler, realistic way that is true and real and organic to the universe. Organic. I keep pointing that word out. I used it earlier today in my very first recording when I read and then sort of waffled on commenting on my, quote, mission statement. Organic, I mean that to not have to do with how it was farmed, right? I don't mean like organic farmed. It's not an organic vegetable. I mean organic, and I don't mean that it has carbon in it, because that is a legitimate definition of the word organic. So anything with carbon, including a pencil, is organic. I mean organic in the sense natural to, inherent, and or belonging in the right and proper order of. The way hair growing out of your body is organic to being a person. Okay? We can agree to things at that level. We can say, hey, although some experiences are extremely rare, there's evidence that these phenomena might indeed be natural and wholly normal, just extremely rare, and thus can be considered organic to the human phenomena. When used in a context of ritual and the culturally reinforced expectation of transformation of consciousness. What does that mean? Well, it means that this plant, as many mystics from various cultures have suggested at various times throughout history, this plant and others might be useful in a ritual use for positive and healthy transformational growth of the full complex of the human organic apparatus on levels both biological, chemical, physiological, and arguably energetic, spiritual, and conscious. And indeed, there is an overwhelming pattern of testimony of people reluctantly or enthusiastically pursuing treatment programs with some or one or all of these entheogenic plants in some concert or coordinated effort to transcend the trauma that they are currently bound by in their life, which is that which they've identified as the pain or the suffering or the limits or the obstacles or the failure or the self-loathing that causes them to feel as though their life is in ruins. And that exploring the internal landscape that seems to be revealed to our otherwise blinded internal perceptive apparatus, which means, what I mean to say is, if the human body is indeed a sophisticated apparatus for perceiving things, why is it so hard to believe that we would not have some equivalent to the one of the five senses and its accompanying organs for a process of internal perception? We must, because we inherently perceive things inside. We perceive our own thoughts in such a way that we can know them and know them privately. We aren't forced to, except for when we're neurotically, absent-mindedly allowing our mouth to just jibber-jabber. We're not forced to, as a species, explicitly state every internal thought, right? So we know inherently that we have an internal perception mechanism. Then why are we also then discouraged or denied the free practice and exploration of the topography or the boundaries or the reach and scope, the breadth and width of this internal sensory mechanism? We're constantly encouraged to belittle imagination and to minimize it to a childish tool that must be reined in and controlled in our adulthood. Right? Because if you're going to live your life out as a debt slave, doomed to constantly operate repetitive tasks that no one else seems willing to do for just enough money in order to get by, then you sure as fuck shouldn't be using your imagination, because if you do, it'll be torture, right? Okay. Well, I rambled long enough. I really am intending to try and keep these things shorter and shorter. But I wanted to share those words of the late, great Terence McKenna. Oh, and I wanted to re-hit this button. Legalization of marijuana, to close out the show. Legalization of marijuana. Warm up the mouth before doing a podcast. The legalization of cannabis, he wrote marijuana, but I'm going to say cannabis, is thus a complex issue. because it involves legitimizing the social factor that might ameliorate or even modify ego-dominant values. Long before I was born, this eccentric gentleman was encouraging all of Western culture to do something about our flagrantly out of control ego problem. Gonna leave it at that, friends. Let's remember as we move forward, as we partake in cannabis, let's enjoy it. Let's enjoy it and enjoy it in the romanticized ways that we also allow ourselves to romanticize alcohol. But let us not allow it to be vilified or turned into through some malicious altering of the organic qualities of the plant, right? We don't need big cannabis turning it into a toxic thing. We don't need it turning into something truly equivalent to alcohol, which is a life-destroying toxic substance, as delightful as it is to drink on occasion. I did not suffer this weekend for any of the silly puns that we were doing this weekend for having a hangover, because I only had a few tasty adult beverages with a meal, and I did not indulge in party level drinking, which, mind you, I'm not pretending to be a saint or anything. I have drank my drinking, and I could, in the heyday of my adult drinking life, drink most average people who fancied themselves a pretty decent drinker straight under the table. So I speak from experience. We're drinking toxic waste, and it slowly destroys your insides, and you suffer the consequences no matter how little or how much you drink it, or no matter how little or how much you believe that it is good. And yet it is also a great giver of pleasure. And as always, as our parents always warned us, and as many of us who suffered the consequences of not understanding the boundaries of moderation in time before overindulging ourselves, because many of us in this world go through those sets of experiences to one degree or another. We must remember that we are sophisticated beings, right? We're complicated machines, these bodies of ours, and that we can do things because they're fun. We can do things because they're good for us. We can do things because they literally heal us in magical ways. Or we can do things because they facilitate our spiritual practices and help us achieve progress towards some greater species-wide healing that might actually radically transform our entire culture. We've got options. Choices must be made, friends. I'll leave you to ponder that. As always, thank you for tuning in. May peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your hearts. Well, folks, that bowl is cashed and dusted. Thank you for joining me for yet another most excellent session of Cannabis Talk. Stay lit, pay it forward, and remember, the world needs healing, and cannabis heals. Until next time, I have been your spiritual cannabis mystic talk show host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. For coughing. as my old and very dear friend of mine used to say, I mean, I guess he still says it, I don't know. He would say, after a good, solid coughing fit, he would, kudos himself. He'd pat himself on the back and say something like, yeah, way to get it in there. And I would ask him I asked him once, after a while of watching him do that, what is that about, man? And he responded, when you're coughing, it's like the opposite of when you're coughing because of cigarettes. When you have a smoker's cough, you're hacking out your lung because it's all gross and nasty and dying from the tar. When you've got the cannabis cough, you're getting the healing nutrients, CBDs and THCs, from the cannabis smoke deeper in your lungs, which is helping to push out and clean all the gross, nasty shit. So that cough is healing. It's the healing cough. Of course, I am severely paraphrasing him, and he was, at the time of that conversation, we were both extremely high. But I digress. A little bonus material for the next Cannabis Talk episode. Okay. And now for the outro.